Здравейте, аз съм Димитър Кенаров и вие слушате подкаста Денивелация към платформата за независима журналистика ДЕН. Днес аз ще водя предаването, следващия път ще го води моята колежка Мария Черешева, след което ще водим отново предаване заедно. Решихме, че ще е интересно да се редуваме като водещи и след което да водим епизоди заедно. За по-голямо разнообразие и всъщност експериментираме. Подкастът е съвсем нов и затова си даваме и пространството да правим всякакви експерименти. Което ми напомня да ви кажа, че е изключително важно да ни дадете обратна връзка. Какво според вас работи, какво не работи, какво ви харесва, какво не ви харесва. Може да пращате коментарите си на office@den.fm. И другото, което исках да кажа е, че понеже ще имаме в този подкаст доста чуждестранни гости, ще правим специално превод, който да бъде с субтитри. Тези субтитри ще може да четете докато гледате подкаста. Колко е странно, нали, човек да каже гледате подкаста. Но докато гледате подкаста в YouTube или в Spotify. Т.е. субтитрите, преводите на български ще бъдат достъпни там. За съжаление не можем да направим цялостен дублаж на епизодите поради проста причина, че ни достигат на този етап и нито финансови средства, нито време. Така че ще слушате звуковите файлове в оригиналния си вид, а за тези, които искат да четат и субтитри, както казах на български, могат да направят това в YouTube или в Spotify. И така, започваме с втори епизод на подкаста Денивелация. Тогава той рече: иди и кажи на този народ: с уши ще чуете и не ще разумеете, и с очи ще гледате и не ще видите. Защото сърцето на този народ е закоравяло и с уши тежко слушат и затворили са очите си, да не би с очи да видят, с уши да чуят и със сърце да разберат, да се обърнат, за да ги изцеря. През последните 2 години често се сещам за тези думи на старозаветния пророк Исаия, докато гледам как гледаме на телефоните си кървавата баня в Газа. Разхвърлените сред руини тела, разхвърлените сред руини човешки крайници, изпостелелите от глад лица, разрушените домове, разрушените болници, разрушените университети. И сякаш нищо не виждаме. Имаме цялата налична информация, цялото човешко знание в джоба си. Екрани, които като магическите огледала от приказките могат да ни покажат какво се случва във всяка една точка по света. Но отказваме да видим. Плачем на филми, които показват ужасите на миналото, войните, насилието и тоталитарните режими. Говорим си за уроците на Аушвиц, но когато Аушвиц се случва пред очите ни, наживо, решаваме бързо да подминем и да скролнем към следващото стори. Може би е прав поетът Т.С. Елиът, когато пише в поемата си 4 квартета, че родът човешки не понася твърде много реалност. Но всъщност ситуацията е по-страшна. Защото онези малцината, които не отказват да видят, които не си затварят очите за огромната трагедия в Газа, чието сърца все още не са достатъчно закоравели, днес биват обвинявани, парадоксално, че те са слепите, че те са безчувствените, че те са полезни идиоти, заблудени идеалисти, които не разбират сложността на ситуацията в Близкия изток, или още по-лошо, че са скрити или съвсем отявлени антисемити, поддръжници на терористи и варвари. И какво толкова са се загрижили за някакви мюсюлмани в някаква далечна територия? Газа, която дори не е и официална държава. В Европа си имаме достатъчно проблеми. Газа обаче се превърна в вододел за Европа, а и за западния свят като цяло. Газа се оказа мястото, където хуманните маски напълно паднаха и целият внимателно граден разказ от Втората световна война насам за универсални човешки права, справедливост и правов ред се срути. Разбира се, света е имал и други геноциди през последните 80 години в Камбоджа, в Босна, в Руанда, в Миянмар, в Конго, в Судан. Но геноцидът в Газа стана първият, който Европа и Америка не само не опитаха да предотвратят, с малки изключения като Ирландия и Испания, но в който те участваха съвсем дейно с доставки на оръжия и финансови средства. В този срамен епизод се включиха, за съжаление, не само политическите елити, но и немалка част от интелектуалните и културните елити. Лицемерието, несъответствието между дела и думи стана твърдо очевидно дори и за слепите. Всъщност не беше разрушена само Газа. Разрушена беше в някакъв смисъл и Европа, разрушена беше и Америка. Разрушен беше митът за Европа и Америка. Разруха, която за съжаление помага само на новите националисти, които чакат удобен момент да изскочат на сцената. Или може би те вече са на сцената. Сред цялата тази разруха обаче останаха да стоят прави много достойни хора, които не се оплашиха въпреки заплахите и обидните думи, въпреки че рискуваха кариерата и препитанието си. Един от тях е моят приятел, американският писател от еврейски произход Бенджамин Моузър. Бен е изключителна личност, ерудит от най-голяма величина, полиглот, който от години живее в Нидерландия. Автор е на биографията на бразилската писателка Кларис Лиспектор, както и на биографията на известната американска писателка и културоложка Сюзан Зонтаг, за която той получи наградата Пулицър през 2020 година. Но отделно от наградите и талантите, Бен е най-вече голям човек, който през последните 2 години не спря да държи очите си и сърцето си широко отворени за Газа. Наскоро той завърши новата си книга, посветена на еврейската история на антиционизма, която предстои да излезе от печат в Щатите през следващата година и която той ми предостави да прочита в ръкопис. В нея той разглежда важни фигури от еврейски произход от целия свят, живели през последните 150 години, които смело са се противопоставили на идеята за ционизма и на отъждествяването на държавата Израел с еврейството. Бен, като автор, е всъщност една от тези фигури. Той е, така да се каже, част от моралната аристокрация на еврейския народ. Добре дошъл в Денивелация, Бен.
Hi there.
Ben, there's been a lot of talk about Zionism, anti-Zionism, and it seems to me that people have been using these terms without really knowing what they mean, and so they've been thrown around quite a lot. And I just think that it will be useful to start this podcast by defining, Zionism, talking a little bit about its history, and then talking a little bit about anti-Zionism as a term. Could you do that?
Well, Zionism is a term that actually has a pretty simple meaning. At its basis, it means the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. Now, a lot of people who are apologists for Zionism will say, well, it also means this and it also means that. It means the revival of the Hebrew language. It means the self-determination of the Jewish people. It means all sorts of things historically. That's sort of true, but it's also really basically about creating a Jewish state in a place that was not a Jewish place. I mean, it was a place that was related to the Jews historically, but so was Egypt, so was Lebanon, so was Italy, so was Bulgaria. Jews have lived in a lot of places for the last thousands of years. And so what it really means in practice is creating a Jewish majority state, a Jewish supremacist state, in a place that 150 years ago was about 3% Jewish. So that's what it means in reality rather than in theory. And then anti-Zionism is those of us who think that was an obviously terrible idea that was going to lead to unending suffering and bloodshed.
When did the first idea of Zionism come about?
Yeah, it's not a Jewish idea. That's really important to understand. The first real kind of Zionist thinking is a Christian idea, and it's specifically a Protestant idea. And it has to do with the fact that the Jews are going to go back to Palestine, and that's going to usher in the second coming of Christ. And there's going to be all sorts of bloody events that are going to happen around this, including throwing the Jews into a lake of fire. So this isn't really a Jewish-friendly idea. And in fact, anti-Zionism among Jews is much older than Zionism. This starts already in the 18th century, and the Jews who pay attention to what Protestants are saying think this is a terrible idea, and it's an anti-Semitic idea, and it's a racist idea. And it's also a way of delegitimizing Jewish aspirations within their own countries. Because, you know, if you're in Bulgaria and you're Jewish, and they say the Jews belong in Palestine, then that undermines the rights of Jews in their own countries. You know, in the struggle that starts really with the American Revolution and the French Revolution, which is to give everybody, regardless of their religion or their race, equal rights.
You actually have a very interesting first chapter, My Grandfather's Herzl, where you discuss the writings of Theodor Herzl, who is the founder of Zionism, so to speak. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, my grandfather was a German refugee who came to this country, to the United States in 1938, as we said. What I learned recently, fairly recently, like 2 years ago, is that his sister went to Palestine in 1933, and she worked in Haifa. And he actually goes to visit her in 1935. And then he thought it was a bad idea, and he returns to Nazi Germany, which is such a crazy thought that a Jewish person would return to Berlin in 1935. But he did, and then luckily they escaped to the United States in 1938. And he brings this book with him, and his sister actually joins them. She comes to New York, and she spends the rest of her life in New York, not in Palestine. And so I was intrigued by this book, but I'd never read it. It was just sort of a thing that was in my house, you know, kind of interesting family memento. And when I finally read it, I was really shocked by it, because I knew about Herzl, I think what most people know about Herzl, which is that he was tormented by anti-Semitism. He comes up with this radical idea to get all the Jews to go back to historic, you know, Palestine. And then, you know, this dream comes true, right? The state of Israel is created. Now, when I was reading this book, I was confronted with somebody who seemed, frankly, and I'm not exaggerating, he seemed insane. He seemed mentally not well. And this isn't even with all the biographical stuff that you learn later when you study his life, when he really seems insane. Like his dream, he wanted to model his Jewish state on Venice, and he wanted to make himself the sort of royal family of the state, and even crown his 4-year-old son Doge of Venice or of Palestine. And it was really bonkers. I mean, it's like hard to explain without sounding like I'm caricaturing it or I'm making fun of him. But you read this and it's not only crazy, but it's really racist. First of all, it's racist against Palestinians who don't really exist in his mind. I mean, he talks very early on also about just removing them, as if any country is going to just say, okay, goodbye. Like if you come to Bulgaria and you say, we're from Bulgaria 5,000 years ago, everybody leave. Like that's not going to work. It wouldn't work in Palestine. It wouldn't work in Thailand. It wouldn't work in Botswana. I mean, it's just a crazy idea.
He was actually considering Argentina as well, right?
Yeah, because it didn't really matter to him. I think he wanted some place where Jews could be dominant. And he writes, and this is one of the crazy things in it, he writes, well, we'll talk to the Argentines and we'll explain why they should give us a big chunk of their country. Like, and it's so crazy because what country in the world like somebody shows up at the president's office and is like, can you give us 3 provinces? What president is going to say, like, okay, sure. Like, it's just insane. But he focuses on Palestine only because he realizes he's good at publicity. And he realizes that Palestine has a kind of emotional appeal to the Jews. And not only to the Jews, I mean, it really has a more emotional appeal to Christians, which is something still to this day being exploited on the behalf of the Israeli tyranny. And so he does this, he starts writing these things, but the really kind of shocking thing to me in the book was not only that he seemed crazy, but also the things he writes about Jews are so racist that in fact, it's very hard before the age of Nazism to find many non-Jews who would write the kinds of poisonous anti-Semitic things that he writes about the Jews. He says they're degraded, they're money grubbing, they're just every stereotype you can think of. And his real obsession is that they're not manly.
Right.
And this is really interesting because he's obsessed with masculinity in a way that becomes, it's painful to read it. It's creepy. You think, ugh, like here he comes again, like dreaming of fighting with swords and stuff. He's really obsessed with militarism. He's obsessed with German nationalism. I think he feels, even though he's Hungarian, I think he feels that he doesn't become a Hungarian nationalist, which would have made more sense and which was something that was, as in a lot of places in Central and Eastern Europe, that was very much in the air in the 19th century. But he's obsessed specifically with Jewish manliness. And it's really, it's uncomfortable to read it, to put it mildly.
Obviously, Theodor Herzl's idea of a Zionist state very much mirrors the romantic idea of the formation of nation states and what, Benedict Anderson has called imagined communities, right? Where the decline of religious empires really leads to sort of a crisis in identity, where and nationalism is a new form of identity that could be supplied and that could be invented, so to speak. Even Bulgarians in the 19th century, when travelers early 19th century, in the 18th century, when travelers went through Bulgaria, they would ask them, who they were, and usually their first answer would be they were Christian or Muslim. So this was their first. The Christian identity was their first, religious identity was their first identity, and then it was later in the late 19th century when Bulgaria became an autonomous and later an independent state, that the formation of this kind of statehood began with the homogenization of Bulgarian language, of the invention, so to speak, of a literary tradition. And so on and so forth. So it seems very much that Herzl writes in that kind of vein, sort of wanting for the Jews to have a state of their own in the context of European nationalism.
Well, this is the really important point: is that this is a European idea. It's not a Jewish idea. It's certainly not a Middle Eastern or Palestinian idea. It's a European idea, and specifically an Eastern European idea that comes out of the formation of these new states in the 19th century. Now, the Bulgarians, just like peoples all throughout the Ottoman and the Austro-Hungarian and the Russian world, they did have an identity as of course, they were Bulgarian speakers. They were not Greeks. They were not Romanian speakers. They were not, Serbs. They knew that, but it wasn't until this becomes militarized that this becomes such a devastating problem that kills so many millions of people. Herzl writes in The Jewish State that people will kill and die for a flag. It's very important to have a flag because once you have a flag, people are prepared to kill other people for it, which of course is true. And he did perceive that accurately. Now, he thought that was a good thing. I think a lot of us would think that was not a good thing. But all these states had to be invented. And actually, in my book, I talk about how that was an anti-Judaic idea. And a lot of Jews didn't think they were a nation in the same way that the Bulgarians or the Poles were a nation. They thought they were a religious nation, not a religious community similar to the Muslims or the Catholics or the Armenians or whatever. Everybody has in these big empires, such as the empire that Bulgaria was a part of, or that a lot of these people who lived more in the north, more in the Russian or the Austrian empires lived in. They had their identity, but it didn't mean armies and states. And in fact, they thought that armies and states were anti-religious and dangerous, physically dangerous, that they would put the Jews in danger rather than protecting them.
Yeah, and then there's the sort of the founding document, I guess, is the so-called Balfour Declaration, which came out towards the end of the First World War. Could you talk a little bit more about that? And you have a character actually who they're two cousins who one is on one side for the establishment of a Jewish state, and the other is against it. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, the Balfour Declaration is a very mysterious thing. Because in fact, so it comes out in 1917 when England, it's issued by the British cabinet against the recommendation, very much against the recommendation of the only Jewish member of the British government, who was called Edward Montagu. And Edward Montagu was from one of the wealthiest families in England, one of the wealthiest Jewish families in England, of whom there were a handful. There was a sort of Jewish aristocracy, as there was in France and in Germany and other countries, certainly in the United States, who were the Jewish families that were considered the real establishment. They were often involved in banking. And this leads to this family feud because his cousin is another very prominent British politician called Herbert Samuel, who's a very dark and nefarious figure. And Samuel pushes this declaration through with the help of Christian Zionists. The thing is, there's almost nobody who wants to be a Zionist. Nobody in England, no Jews in England want to go to Palestine.
Right, because they're British citizens.
They're British. Well, and that's a hard-fought status because, in fact, the British Jews are integrated legally much later than they are in a lot of other countries, most prominently including France and the United States, where that possibility exists since the revolutions of the late 18th century. The British Jews aren't admitted into Parliament until 1858, so it's actually quite late. In the West, it's late. And so the Balfour Declaration promises the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Now, what's so strange about this is that, first of all, there's no constituency for it among British Jews. The Zionist organization is run out of a hotel room in London, and it's so small that the guy in charge of it keeps the archives underneath his bed. I mean, that's how small this thing is. So how do they get the biggest empire in the world to promise this territory that, by the way, they don't own? This territory is still under the sovereignty of the Ottoman Empire. So they're saying we are going to establish a colony for people who don't want it in a territory that we don't even have because of some guy in a hotel room. It's really a strange thing, but a lot of the appeal was, which Zionists still do to this day, they appeal to conspiratorial ideas of Jewish power.
What seemed fascinating, and you mentioned this a little bit earlier in the conversation, is how, in fact, Zionists had the same agenda as the worst anti-Semites in Europe, who wanted to get rid of the Jews in their own countries, and they saw the Zionists as a way to do that they would, take all the Jews to Palestine, and in fact, all the citizens, Jewish citizens of France, of Britain, of other countries, would end up leaving those countries. So in a sense, it was the dream of the anti-Semites to have that kind of state. So I was very struck by the way sort of these two discourses were, supplanting each or helping each other.
Well, Herzl says from the very beginning that anti-Semites will be our best friends. And he's not only anti-Semitic himself, but he's very sympathetic to anti-Semitism. And this is why, in my book, it's all about why Jews oppose Zionism. And one of the reasons is that it's basically an anti-Semitic idea. It basically says, sir and ma'am, living in Sofia or living in Marseille or living in Chicago, you don't really belong in your own country. You need to go off to this other place that you've probably never been to. And in fact, when Zionism starts, not only have very few Jews visited Palestine, but they don't even know anybody who has. It's not a place where Jews immigrate. Jews immigrate, the Eastern Jews immigrate mainly to the United States. And secondarily, they might immigrate to places like France or England or other, Western countries like Canada or Australia or South Africa. That nobody goes to Palestine. But the idea that this is the place you really belong. You don't belong in Poland or in Germany or in Italy or in, England. You belong in Palestine, which is a country you've never actually really seen. You don't know anyone who lives there. You don't know anything about it. You don't speak the language. And by the way, we're going to invent a new language that's going to be your native language, even though this isn't a language anybody's actually spoken in thousands of years. It was revived starting in the 19th century it was a literary language and it was a liturgical language. So a lot of men knew Hebrew. And it's important to say men because women were not educated in the same way. Men were taught Hebrew as a religious language in traditional Jewish communities. But by the end of the 19th century, people don't speak these languages anymore, even educated men, particularly in the West. In the Russian Empire particularly, they still are learning Hebrew. But it's just something totally foreign. And in order to create this idea, they have to insist on the fact that you are not at home in your own country. And so this was an idea that many people, especially people who were either religious or who were liberals, who believed in universal human rights, resisted absolutely, because it undermined the fight for freedom and equality, and it also adopted a racial idea that was a sort of social Darwinian idea, a very 19th century idea of this hierarchy of races, and said that Jews are somehow this foreign element in their own countries. And this was, of course, there's so many ways that you can object to this, that people wore out newspapers and books explaining the objections to this.
Right, and it was basically, as you're saying, Judaism is a religious community. Suddenly it's supplanted with this modernized, racialized version of a community, 19th century.
Right, and this is something that does happen, as you said, it does happen in a lot of places. There is certainly in the Balkans, for example, there's a racial idea of like Christians being separate from Muslims as some sort of incompatible, inhuman thing. This happens everywhere. And it's anybody who doesn't want the world to collapse into warfare and violence has to resist this idea, because once you start opening that box, nationalism and racism and Nazism they're pretty close behind, and that's exactly what happened.
And let's here actually put in a good word about the Ottoman Empire. Bulgarians are going to kill me about that, because we're taught.
The Ottoman Empire was a lot better than what happened after.
To hate the Turks, that's what we're taught from the very early age. But in fact, a lot of Sephardic Jews moved in the 16th century, moved to the Ottoman Empire because, like Christians, yes, Christians and Jews were second-class citizens, but they were still people of the book, and therefore they could have their own communities, their own, their own cultural institutions, education, and even in certain cases their own legal systems locally.
They did all of the above, and in fact, the Ottoman Empire was an age of cohabitation. It had to be. Actually, the Ottomans were never about destroying people's cultures, and they were really about just taxing people and controlling them in certain ways, military ways, but not about destroying these cultures. And they couldn't have. The large majority of Ottoman citizens were not Turks.
Yeah,
they were Arabs, in fact. And then there were the Christians of the Balkans. But and there were lots of other peoples. And the Jews lived in the Ottoman Empire with no problem at all. They always say they're second-class citizens, but this is also quite doubtful. In some places, there were lots of Christians in very high positions. There were lots of Jews in very high positions. It wasn't this kind of 19th century nationalism that we're talking about, that comes about, that's exclusive, that says, if you are Turkish, or Russian or Serbian. You cannot live in Bulgaria. That's an idea that didn't really exist until the 19th century. And it's an idea that led to unbelievable calamities and bloodshed. And so, and nowhere more clearly than in the case of the Jews, both Jews as victims and Jews as perpetrators.
But then comes the Holocaust. 6 million Jews are killed in Europe, and the Jewish state is established 3 years after the end of the war. And here to just bring in Bulgaria again, Bulgaria was one of the few countries that managed to save the majority of its Jews, not all of them. 11,000 were murdered in occupied territories and were sent to Poland. But the majority of Jews living in the Old Kingdom of Bulgaria and the territory, about 42,000, if memory serves me well, were saved. There were, of course, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic laws because Bulgaria was an ally of Nazi Germany, various kinds of taxation laws for Jews. Obviously, I mean, we adopted many of the sort of Nazi policies in terms of also labor camps. So we should not minimize what the regime did during the Second World War here. At the same time, those Jews did survive. But then Israel is founded in 1948. And the vast majority of Bulgarian Jews leave for Israel, and as well as in many, surviving Jews from many other countries.
Well, this is important that you bring this up because why do they leave to Israel? Now, this is a question. Different countries are different, of course. In the case of Romania, for example, where quite a lot of Jews did survive as well, although the situation was much worse than in Bulgaria. They were purchased by Israel. In other places, these were called the displaced persons, DPs. And the Bulgarian Jews were not really displaced, actually. So why do they all go to Israel? Well, one of the reasons is that these people, of whom there were hundreds of thousands all across Europe, these people had basically 3 desires. If the first desire was just to go home. After everything that happened, if you're from Bulgaria, you probably want to live in Bulgaria. Right? You don't want to leave, even if it's a regime you don't like, but most people just want to go home. That was the first choice for most people. And they were surveyed, and these were, journalists and human rights workers did a lot of research into what these people wanted. The second thing they wanted was basically to go to the United States. If you can't go back to Bulgaria, then I'll go to California, where a lot of people had relatives and friends, and they had communities of different peoples. If you were from Poland or you were from Austria, you could find a way in the United States. The third choice was to go to another Western country, right? So that's when you would say, okay, I'll go to Argentina, or I'll go to South Africa, or I'll go to France, or somewhere like that. The fourth choice, and by far the least popular, was to go to Palestine. People had to be forced to go to Palestine, actually. And Zionism schemed with great energy to prevent people from making the previous 3 choices, going home, going to America, or going to another Western country. So these people get basically forced because Israel has a demographic problem, which is that Jews don't really want to go there. And even after 48 and the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, there's still basically a minority. They're a majority within 48, but they're not a majority within historic Palestine. And of course, outside historic Palestine, there's hundreds of millions of Arabs. So they basically forced these people to come to Israel, which is what they did even during the war, and something in my book that's very important when I write about Hannah Arendt, is to say that the Zionists worked with the Nazis to force people out of Germany to go to Palestine, which again, they didn't want to do. They didn't know it was a completely different culture. It was a completely different world. And they didn't want to go to Palestine. But the Zionists made sure that not only did a lot of people go to Palestine, but a lot of their money went to Palestine. And they wanted wealthy people. They didn't want poor people. It was never about helping Jews. It was about helping Zionism.
Right. And people didn't matter as much as the idea of Zionism.
No. Individuals were totally irrelevant in this calculus.
Yeah. I wanted, since you mentioned Arendt, I would love to talk more about her since she's one of the really famous people in your book that you speak about, that you write about. But also just to mention an episode, I think it was in that chapter, where I was really struck by this, that there were Jewish children that had to go to various Western countries to be saved from the Nazis. But the Zionists would not allow them. They would say either they go to Palestine or they would not be saved, basically. Or they would...
Or we don't care if they die.
We don't care if they die.
Yeah. That's David Ben-Gurion says this in the early part of the war. He said there's an option for tens of thousands of Jewish children to go to England where they would have been safe. And he said we would rather have half of them die than for all of them to go to England. Which is something that if you think about what that means, half of the children in Germany could die, but that would be okay if the other half went to Palestine. And you find Zionist leaders saying these things time and time again. They're absolutely indifferent to Jewish lives and suffering. All they care about is this totalitarian fantasy that comes from Herzl. All they care about is power. All they care about is building this state. And in order to do that, they are more than willing, they're eager to work with Nazis who have the same ideas about the Jews that they do, namely that they are a foreign race and that they need to go to Palestine.
So in a sense, I mean, Zionism was the next to final solution for Nazis, in a sense. There were...
Well, Eichmann goes between this. His preferred solution, and a lot of the Nazis actually, Zionism was very attractive to them because it would get rid of, first of all, it adopted this European nationalist idea that they found very sympathetic, but secondly, because it would get rid of the Jews. And a lot of them, in the 30s especially, they weren't thinking about what happens in the Holocaust. There's not really a discussion of let's shove them all into gas chambers. They're just talking about how do we get rid of the Jews? So the best way to get rid of the Jews is, send them all to Tel Aviv. And that was a quite mainstream view within Nazism, and it happened to be the exact same view that the Zionists had.
And here comes Hannah Arendt in this context. Arendt, of course, for our listeners, maybe we should give a little bit of context, but she's one of the most famous 20th century philosophers, a student of Martin Heidegger. And they, Heidegger, who actually was allied to a certain extent with the Nazis. But could you talk a little bit more about Arendt and her career and how she wrote Eichmann in Jerusalem, that famous book, and how she was attacked by Zionists?
So Hannah Arendt, another thing to say about her is she was young-ish when she leaves Germany in 1933, and she comes to the United States in 1941 or 1940. And she does something which few of those, well, not few, but she becomes a very prominent American philosopher and a public figure. So she's very famous in the United States as well as having been a notable person in Germany. And she writes in English after she gets to the United States. And in 1961, she goes to Jerusalem because Adolf Eichmann has been arrested in Buenos Aires by the Israeli state and brought to Jerusalem. And he's going to be put on trial. And she's fascinated by this because as a German Jewish refugee, she wants to see the guy who did this. It's the last chance she can actually look in the eyes somebody who committed these crimes. And she gets there, and he's actually, this is the famous thing about that book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, is that he's actually a completely unremarkable person. He's not some villain. He's not some monster. He's just a pretty average bureaucrat. He's not particularly intelligent. However, one of the things that she discovers and she writes about in a series of articles for the New Yorker magazine here is that he was incredibly sympathetic to Zionism. And when she publishes this as a book, now this was something known to historians, that the Zionists had been sympathetic to Nazism.
And Eichmann went to Palestine, actually, right? He went on a visit to Palestine.
Eichmann gets kicked out of Palestine, but he gets kicked out. He goes to Haifa. He gets kicked out by the British after a couple of days. And then he goes to Cairo, and he meets with the head of the Zionist Secret Service. This is in 1936, maybe 1935. I think it's 1936. And they talk about how to get the German Jews to go to Palestine. And it's all very friendly. It's at Cafe Gropi, which is like the old, kind of traditional cafe in the center of downtown Cairo. Cairo, which is basically under British rule at the time. So, this is a place that would be swarming with Secret Service. I mean, it's not like it wasn't a discreet meeting. It was actually totally open. And Eichmann, the only book he ever reads, apparently, according to Hannah Arendt, is Herzl. And he's fascinated by Herzl. And he's very sympathetic to Herzl. So what happens, what I describe in my book, is that the Zionists, starting with the prime minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, the same guy who said it wasn't so bad if half the Jewish children in Germany were slaughtered if it helped Zionism, he orchestrates a hate campaign against Hannah Arendt, who, again, is this incredibly respected. She's kind of elderly at this point. I mean, she's not that old, but she's kind of a senior figure, respected universally, and slanders her for year after year after year. There's this hate campaign against her, which is very similar to the way the Zionists still operate. I mean, they still slander everybody who gets in their way.
So could you talk a little bit more about your personal motivation to write this book? I think in the popular mind, anti-Zionism is oftentimes connected to anti-Semitism. And this is, of course, a function of Israeli propaganda and the way the political discourse has been shaped around Gaza and around other events, of course. But what you're offering us in your book is an alternative history of Judaism. These are Jewish figures of resistance who are fighting Zionism, anti-Zionist Jews. So could you talk a little bit more about how you ended up writing this book?
Yeah, I've always been fascinated by these figures because Zionism, I grew up with Zionism, not in the way some people do. As I say at the beginning of the book, I didn't come from a hysterical Zionist background, but I came from a very typical American Jewish background where people were Zionists. And, my parents, for example, they never went to Israel, but they thought Israel was a great idea and they thought it was very nice. But like a lot of Americans, we sort of regard the rest of the world as, sort of far away, and we don't really think about it that much. But we're proud of it. We wish it well. We want to help everybody. This is typical American thinking. But they didn't look too close into it. And I got very interested in it just for other reasons when I was a little bit older. I learned Hebrew. I spent not much time there, but I spent enough time there to think this is really bad. This is a crazy country. And it really is. If you're there, it's a crazy place to be that you can't compare with anywhere else. I was fascinated by Jewish history and culture, not by nationalism, but I was sympathetic to Jewish nationalism. And after October 7th happened, if you know anything about Zionism, you know how violent it is. And you knew that it was going to respond in some horrifying way. It wasn't just going to send in, some police to try to arrest people who are responsible for this. They were going to actually try to destroy the Palestinian people yet again. Now, they've tried that, and the reason you know this is because, first of all, there's a lot of total fanatics in the government of the Israeli state, but also because time and time again, their only response to everything is violence. So whether it's Hannah Arendt writing a book or whether it's, Palestinian liberation fighters, fighting back against this occupation, you know what they're going to do, which is try to destroy anything that gets in their way. And that's what they did. So for me, writing this book was a way of asserting the presence and the authority and the moral precedence of the people that I write about.
And how did you end up choosing these people? Because you've chosen people from a period of like 150 years.
Yeah.
From mid 19th century up until Nan-Goldin is your last character in your book, where you actually get to meet Nan-Goldin and interact with her. For Bulgarian listeners, she's one of the most amazing visual artists currently living in the US, and a photographer. Definitely worth checking out her work. But it seems that a lot of the figures, except for Arendt and Golden, the rest are not very well known figures. How did you end up choosing those figures from all over the world chronologically? Yeah.
Well, because I'm glad you asked this, because this was really hard. This is in some ways as hard as writing the book was finding out who the figures should be. So as you say, I have people from 5 continents, from Latin America, from North America, from Europe, from Asia, and from Africa. I wanted it to be as diverse as Jews are diverse, because one of the things about Zionism is it tries to make all Jews look the same. But of course, like Jews from Ethiopia are not the same as Jews from California. Right? I mean, it's just completely crazy. Only if you admit this racial fantasy that these people have could you say that there's something other than a Jewish, religious history. And so I went to South Africa, and I looked really hard because I wanted everybody to illustrate something that's their own life story, but it's also they tell a bigger story. So in the case of South Africa, I have this incredible freedom fighter named Ronnie Kasrils, who's one of the heads of the armed wing of the African National Congress, and who lives in exile for decades and comes back when democracy comes to South Africa and becomes a minister in the government. So that's his personal story, which is fascinating, but it's also a story of like, what do we mean by apartheid? When we use this word, what do we mean by it in international law and international parlance? But also, like, what does it mean emotionally for a Jewish South African to look at Israel and see the same sorts of mechanisms, dehumanization, racial classification that he saw in his own country? So that's one thing. And then, I wanted to tell a very diverse story about religious people, about non-religious people, different kinds of religious people, as well as about, atheists and socialist internationalists. I wanted to tell about men. I wanted to tell about women. I wanted to tell about different political contexts. So I have a Brazilian journalist in there who is a very heroic figure who, who's of Sephardic background. Actually, her parents were both born in Turkey, in Izmir. And I just wanted to tell the story as broadly and as diversely as I could, because it is a huge story.
Actually, did you find other books dedicated to this kind of anti-Zionist Jews before when you wrote your book, or it was all research that you did originally, and most of these people were absolutely unknown?
Well, I mean, some of them are unknown. So I have a famous story in the Netherlands, which is about Jacob Israel de Haan, who was a gay poet, who was the first Jew murdered by Zionists in Palestine. He's killed in 1924. Now, it's not because he's gay, it's not because he's Dutch, it's not because he's a poet, it's because he's smart, and he gets there as a Zionist. He's the first Dutchman to immigrate to Palestine as a Zionist. And he gets there and he figures out this is a horrible idea. Basically, he looks around and he sees there's a lot of Arabs. This story that like this is a land without a people is just a total lie. So making a long story short, he's murdered. Now, in the Netherlands, certain people, literary people, know this story because he was a great Dutch poet. But like people even in Belgium or Germany have never heard of him because, people haven't really heard of poets who died 100 years ago, even in their own countries. So it's not that these people were all totally unknown. It's that they were unknown outside of their very specific contexts. And so like among Egyptian leftists, Ahmed Sadiq Saad, who's my Egyptian character, he's, they know who he is, but like people who are interested in Egyptian communist history, it's not that many people. So there is a kind of archaeology involved, and I think that when people see it all together, they'll be very impressed by it. I mean, Nan Goldin, whom you mentioned, who's my friend, who's still alive. I'm going to see her today. People know her as a photographer of basically, the underworld of Bohemian New York. That's what she's, if you're going to reduce it to that. And she's and people know her as a famous American artist. They don't know that she's been a Palestinian activist for 60 years. Since she was a teenager, she's been involved in Palestine.
Right.
So I'm trying to tell, even if it's, or Hannah Arendt, people know who she is, but they don't know this story. And the reason they don't know the story is because it's been actively, violently suppressed.
Yeah. No, and I mean, it's, how should I say, since the beginning of the war in Gaza, I've noticed that a lot of my Jewish friends in the States have been very much on the side of Gaza, of like the oppressed people there. But I haven't seen, to be very honest with you, a lot of Jewish voices in Bulgaria who have come out publicly in defense of Gaza. Now, I know from sort of conversations with Jewish friends here in Bulgaria that the main organization Shalom, they've pressed a lot of people, a lot of their members, to toe the line, the Zionist line. And I understand, in a small community, Jewish community like the Bulgarian one, you don't want to be a pariah, right? Suddenly you come out with a statement on Palestine, and suddenly nobody from the Jewish community wants to speak to you. So, I sort of understand that, but I see the amount of pressure that has been exerted on people, which is enormous. I mean, you speak about Nan Goldin and how, she was, the problems she had in Germany, and Germany is a whole separate basket case, considering the war, around the war in Gaza. But I'm curious with you, writing this book, having these opinions publicly, in the American press, in the New York Times, I would just want to know what kind of challenges within the Jewish community you had with your opinions, with writing this book. What was the kind of pressure? How, you lost friends perhaps. So just, could you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, yeah, this is an important thing to talk about because it's so painful for everybody. And of course, it's different in every community. I mean, Bulgaria is a small community, although I think a lot of people are going to be finding their way back to Sofia in the next couple of years when Israel becomes more and more unlivable. Germany, as you mentioned, is an incredible basket case, which has been just a terrible thing. I mean, the way they treated Nan was awful. And Nan, again, Nan is probably the most respected artist in the United States. I think it's probably fair to say. She's universally venerated. She's 72 years old. Yeah. She is, she has an incredible career, and they trashed her in Germany. And I explain what they did to her in this book. So nobody is safe. Hannah Arendt wasn't safe. At the same time, in this country where I usually live in the Netherlands, which is also a small Jewish community, which is very Zionistic. But in the United States, there's a lot more diversity of Jewish opinion, just because there's a lot of Jews here. And it's not, we aren't really considered a minority in the American context, which has its own problems, because the Jews, I think, in my view, have become quite arrogant. I mean, the Jewish leadership has just been a scandal. It's one thing to say that, okay? It's another thing to say what it's meant to people personally. It's been very hard personally. It is really shocking to find out that the person you thought was a nice guy that you would go to dinner with and were excited to see and liked his children and whatever, that this person actually is supportive of genocide. And a lot of the people I know, because I've been involved in the Palestinian cause for quite a long time, so everybody knows this about me. So it's already like real Zionist crazies. They have they got rid of me a long time ago, or I got rid of them. But it's, the real problem, I think, in this country and in other places, like you mentioned the New York Times, it's not that they're actually in favor of genocide, but it's that they're not against genocide enough to actually speak out against it. So you have these people who said, oh, but on the other hand, you have to understand this, you have to understand that. Talking down to people like me as if we are stupid and as we don't keep up. And this is something that I hope this book will illuminate, is that the people who know the most about Zionism like it the least. And so there's something incredibly sinister about discovering this kind of, to put it in religious terms, this kind of sin among people you know. And it's very disheartening, but I have to say, I have gained more friends from this than I've lost. I have grown closer to certain people, including a lot of Jews, including a lot of Palestinians and Arabs, but including a lot of people that just turn out to be decent people, like people I wouldn't have necessarily been super close to, but I've become close to them because I see who they are, and I see that they care about the things I care about. And so it's, I think it's very important to say that you can make it sound like it's a sad story. And in certain cases it is, but I would say generally, I've ended up with better people than I started out with.
Well, and the final question here is exactly what do we do from here? I mean, a lot of people, would refer to Israel as a settler colonial project. I'm pushing a little bit against that because I think every country, in a sense, is a settler colonial project. The U.S. is a settler colonial project. Just It happened, a much longer time, a long time ago. I mean, you grew up in Texas, and Texas, after all, was sort of the beginnings of the American Empire after the Mexican-American War of 1849, when Texas was taken over from Mexico. And in a sense, that was, Texas was, sort of a colonial project as well. But do we kick out the people from the U.S.? They're already there. It's already a fait accompli, right? And so how can we solve this? I mean, without saying, okay, Israel should not exist, because Israel does exist. It's impossible, to have it any other way. We're living in this reality. We can imagine many alternative realities, but this is the reality we live in. So how do you imagine the future of Israel from this point on?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. The settler colonial background is very fascinating, and it's very nuanced, because there's a lot of countries that come out of this. All of Latin America comes out of this.
Yeah.
All of North America comes out of this. Australia, New Zealand, it all comes out of this. There have been settler colonial projects that have failed. Algeria, for example, Rhodesia, South Africa to a certain extent. But when I'm in South Africa, of course, it's horrible what happened in South Africa, or it's horrible what happened in Texas. It's horrible what happened in Brazil or in Argentina. I mean, it's a pretty common story. I would say the difference is, first of all of those countries now have equal rights for everybody. None of those countries kicked out. Brazil didn't kick out everybody of Portuguese background. Right. Instead, we have fought in all of these countries for equality. We've fought for equal rights. We've fought against the concept of race. We've fought against, certainly, apartheid and genocide. I mean, this is what's so hard about it, is that we've come so far in the case of Israel that it's very hard to imagine anything else. But what I've always said, and what a lot of the people in my book have said, is there's one state there. There's not two states. There's never going to be two states. The proper solution would be to do exactly what you do in a lot of places. The Netherlands, for example, which everybody thinks is this kind of boring, peaceful country, but in fact, the Netherlands is half Catholic, and having it be half Catholic was a problem really deep until the 19th century. And Catholics didn't have civil rights, or they didn't have the same civil rights. They were disqualified from office. they were disqualified from the royal family, from parliament. I mean, it was really a quite divided society. Well, now Catholics vote and they can do whatever they want, and it makes absolutely no difference. Right. So why is Israel the only country in the world where that wouldn't work? You know, why is it okay for French Protestants and Jews to have equal rights, but it wouldn't work in Israel? Like, why is it okay? Would you say England should be a country where only male property-owning members of the Church of England should be allowed to vote? Like, nobody would say that, but actually we're not that far from that. We're actually only a couple of generations from that. Mm-hmm. You know, we're only a couple of generations, amazingly enough, from like, I don't know about Bulgaria, but like women couldn't vote in this country until a little bit more than 100 years ago. And in other countries, it was a lot later than that. Like in France, it was
Switzerland, I think it was in the 70s, actually.
Yeah, in some parts of Switzerland.
In some cantons,
Some cantons. But yeah, I mean, these were like really controversial things. And actually, like, you can't point to any country in the world that has done worse because women could vote or because ethnic or racial minorities could vote. So there's a kind of Jewish exceptionalism here that says that like only in this country is something that you support in no other country. You would never say like, I don't think like, you know, Bulgarian Muslims should be able to vote. Like nobody would say that. Nobody would say like, I don't think that like, you know, gypsies should be able to vote in Spain. Okay, but like you go back like only a few years and people did say this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So my solution is the same solution that it would be for anywhere else, which is give everybody equal rights.
Ben, thank you so much for this conversation. It was super interesting.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you know, this is the first conversation about your book.
The first, the very, very first.
The very first, and I really hope that the book comes out in Bulgarian as well. After
I
it
do
comes out
too.
in English.
I do too. I'd be happy to have it there, and I really do. As I said, I feel like don't sell out your own country. Don't sell out your own values. Like don't think of yourself as this tiny little irrelevant, sad country. Because if you think of that, it's just like people who think, "Oh, I'm so sad." It becomes true.
Yeah, self-fulfilling prophecy in a sense. Yeah,
it is a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
All right. Well, great to talk to you.
Thank you, Ben.